But people do love these history books on Youngstown, on the Mahoning Valley.
Right.
Yeah. I think they're like perennial Christmas presents all over the place.
Well, I think there's a mixture of nostalgia, but I think if you do it right, you know, and as a journalist, you know this. I mean, you can surprise people.
Right.
And I think that's what I think is gratifying to people is that I'll never forget. Well, Josh Foster, who has sadly passed, probably would have been in a position to write a magisterial study on organized crime in Youngstown. That was kind of his focus. As much as he knew about the Jewish community, he probably knew more about that. And I'll never forget there was it was the former Beacon restaurant near Campbell, and I think it was called the City Limits at that point. But the owner said that a lot of the people who frequented this particular restaurant were elderly gentlemen who had been involved in the numbers racket, or they've been at some level have been involved in organized crime. And he said, you got to bring your friend Josh to talk to these guys. Now Josh is 40, maybe, okay? And so they're thinking, who's this baby? You know, they're really not that impressed when he walks in. And before you know it, they were hanging on every word. They had the ground level experience, but he could provide the context. And they were absolutely fascinated. And I think that's what history does. And I think when you're dealing with ethnic history, in the case of the Jewish community, for instance, or any other community, it's almost like applying theory to something. Things pop to the foreground that might not otherwise. Every community brought unique gifts to this area, and I think those if you do a historical narrative in a way that it should be done, it's going to include some surprises for people. Yeah. And this, of course, was this is not out there.
This is the latest one.
This is the latest one that's been published. Now, it wasn't published; it was privately published, and so, you know, I kind of had a hard time. I have a hard time promoting it because, you know, people call when I have promoted it, people call me up and say, "Where can I buy it?"
I think it's available at the
It is
Eastwood
available.
Mall, right?
It is available at the Eastwood Mall. That's the one place where it's available at Books a Million.
Right.
And so fortunately, there is some availability because I do think it's a wonderful contribution to local history, and by the way, drew heavily on the kind of research I did for my dissertation as well, because so much of what created the mall industry were the kind of post-war trends that also contributed to the decline of urban institutions.
Right.
So, and Tony was very pleased with it. There were about 80 interviews involved, which was excessive even for me. So. And the latest project, of course, and I'm very proud of that. But again, it's not out there in the same way that some of the other books are.
Right.
Although it is now available at the Eastwood Mall, which is a good thing.
Yeah, these are like at the checkout line.
These are you get online, you can get anywhere. Yeah.
Right.
So, in any case, the latest project is actually a history of the Ursuline Sisters of Youngstown.
Okay.
And this
who are still active.
Who are still active.
Right.
And so it's not another of the lost series where we're talking about things that are gone. We are talking about something that has transformed. And unlike the book on the schools, you know, you're talking about people who continue, an organization that continues to have an impact on the Valley, but has changed as a result of not only demographics, but also changes within the Catholic Church. And one of the things that led to that project was I was actually set out to do one on the Irish community.
Okay.
And Irish Youngstown. And that project, as it turned out, could not be funded. Couldn't get the funding for it. So, but I was so confident that there would be interest. Sadly not, but I was so confident there would be interest that I did some preliminary interviews, and some of those happened to be in the Ursuline community. Sister Mary McCormick, Sister Patricia McNicholas, Sister Isabel Rudge, who's half English and half Irish. There were some interesting stories there. But in any case, that was what caught the attention of Michelle Gatz, who's the communications director, of course.
Used to work with the Business Journal.
Of course, yes, exactly. Yeah. And Michelle was may have been aware of the fact that I had approached Sister Nancy years earlier about the prospect of doing something along these lines, with more of a focus on movers and shakers within the Ursuline community and how they reflected the kind of transformation that took place. This, of course, I think is a better project because you're not leaving anyone out and you have a more comprehensive history. But she was aware of the fact that the 150th anniversary was right around the corner. And she said, why don't we do a book on the Ursulines?
Sure.
And so, as it turned out, I was able to roll some material. I obviously did follow-up interviews with all the members of the Ursuline community because this was a different subject. But the fact that I had done interviews with them before was an advantage. So far, there have been close to 30. In fact, if you consider that some of those interviews involved 2 people, probably more than 30. Because you don't interview people as single entities, obviously. And their experiences intersect, but they're distinct. So more than 30 interviews, I guess, at this point. And I'm starting work right now in the first chapter, which is going to cover the community from 1874, perhaps into the very early 1900s.
Okay.
What's significant about the community is that the story looked at from one perspective could be one of decline. I mean, when you're talking about the fact that when the Ursuline Mother House was built in 1963, it was built to accommodate 110 sisters and novices. Okay, and now there are 29 women living in that, or members of the order, not living in the community. That is deceptive, though, because basically a number of things happened that affected religious communities throughout the country. And one of them appears to be is there were more opportunities for women. In the 1960s, fewer and fewer were drawn to religious life. There was also Vatican II, I guess, played an inadvertent role because there was more of an emphasis on, there was less of an elevation of the religious and clergy, and more like you can serve God in a variety of ways. And so people started to think in those terms. Okay.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, there was a steep decline in vocations in the late 1960s that affected communities throughout the country and throughout the world, really. In any case, the Ursulines during that period were also encouraged to look at their history, to look at who their founder was and what her goals were. And what they found was quite surprising. They found that St. Angela Merici, when she was active in 16th century Italy, did not found a religious order, did not found an order of cloistered nuns. She found a tertiary order of lay people, women who were loosely connected in community, and basically met the needs of the community, whatever those happened to be. And in 16th century Italy, in northern Italy, in Brescia, where she was based, one of the needs was exploited women because they'd been invaded by France. And there's always exploitation that takes place in those kinds of situations. So they were really kind of active helping these women get back to a path toward a stable life, family, things like that. They also worked closely with male lay people to establish hospitals for so-called incurables. And there's people who were affected by syphilis. Were not cloistered until really the Counter-Reformation. And a lot of that happened because there was a saying in Italy, and I'm sure there are variations throughout Europe, a husband or a wall. You either were married or you were in a cloister, okay?
Right.
Because otherwise you were vulnerable as a woman. And so that was a factor in the fact they were cloistered. Also, the Counter-Reformation put a big emphasis on Catholic education. Okay, and for the Ursulines that worked out because since they were a cloistered community at that point, they were limited in what they could do as a ministry. They could have young women come in and take classes, okay? And so that's really when that transformation takes place. So you have, in a sense, a community that's coming full circle.
Right.
Yeah, working closely with lay people, fewer and fewer members of the religious community, and they've also been visionary in their approach to the facility itself. Many religious communities have had to tear down their mother houses because they simply were white elephants, okay? As early, and I believe this would have been the 1990s, I'm a little early in the research right now, but one of my interviews was Paul Raschuti, who was invited by Sister Nancy Dawson to do a master plan of the mother house and decide what they could do to make the best use of that space. And so you have now a mother house that's not only a residential facility for sisters, there is that component still, obviously, but they have senior housing. They have a preschool. They have the Ursuline Center. So it's a real resource for the community, and so they have been, I think, ahead of the curve. When you look at religious communities throughout the country, they've been ahead of the curve in terms of planning for the inevitable,
right?
Okay, which is the shrinking of the community, but they don't want to lose the ministries. And so they have brought in more and more lay people. I'm an Ursuline associate. There are number of us, 90, I believe, associates who are primarily volunteers. They've also brought in people who are, very competent professionals. Bridget Kennedy, who was actually had been a novice at one point and now has a family. She's the president of Ursuline Ministries. Okay, but it does become a challenge because you don't want these ministries to become soulless.
Right.
And I think that's where there's been a real emphasis on what's called the charism of St. Angela Merici. And that is, they really want people to become acquainted with her thought and her motivations. It's not just what you do, it's how you do it and why you do it. And so even Ursuline High School at this point, and I went there in the 70s, and there was, St. Angela was a picture on the wall. Okay, we never talked about St. Angela or her ministries, and I think that's a big part of the curriculum at Ursuline today. And there's a real, and it's kind of ironic because when I was there were still a lot of teaching nuns.
Yeah.
And that's not the case today, obviously. But there's more of an emphasis on the connection between the school and the religious community, even though it was taken over by the diocese in 1954. Founded by the Ursulines in 1905, by 1954 the diocese took over with the understanding that it would be staffed primarily, if not exclusively, by Ursuline nuns. But and that's one of their big legacies, of course, is the high school, but also the ministries. Yeah.
Well, see, I think that's kind of another example of we're talking about history, and generally speaking, I think sometimes people assume that the way something is the way something always has been. And you're talking about the history of the Ursuline Sisters, and you go back to the founding, and you're, I had no idea that it wasn't always this religious organization, that it was, that it started out this way. I think it's fascinating sometimes when you go back and we always presume that that is how it always was. And oftentimes when we look into these traditions or these organizations, we find out, something surprising.
Exactly.
That's not at all how it started out as,
And that's really in a way the story of Vatican II, was looking at the history.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing this as an unchanging, perfect society, the church in this case. I think it also could be true of education, and that's why I think it's sad that educational history has been pushed to the margins, because when people mythologize education.
Right.
There was a golden age.
Everything.
It was great. And now it stinks. Okay?
Yeah, everything that happened when I was a kid was awesome. Yeah.
Exactly. And what they don't realize is that the challenges that are prevalent today were prevalent in the past. Language issues, for heaven's sakes, with immigration.
Right.
We had lots of language issues. The language might not be Spanish. It might be another language. Yeah. You had periods when you had, because of people with language difficulties, you had children of various ages in one classroom with a wide variety of English language skills. It was chaos in some cases, okay? I mean, the thing is that we idealize the past.
Yeah.
We see it as a simpler time, and the complexities of the current educational system were evident in the past.
Sure.
But because educators are not talking to the public, they can't complain that the public is not listening to them, okay? Because if you want people to understand something, tell them a story. And what better way to do that than to present a historical narrative?
And we've been talking, and we've talked a little bit about the Catholic community, which I presume is mostly Italian. We've talked about the German community. We've talked about the Irish community. One of the things I find fascinating about this area is you could almost pick any nationality or ethnicity, and you could talk about their history in the Mahoning Valley.
Absolutely.
And I kind of think that's one of the aspects that makes Mahoning Valley, this region's history, interesting, because it's sort of a little microcosm of the immigrant story in America, or America itself, because the steel industry kept drawing these waves of people from different parts of the world. I guess, what do you, since you've been doing all of this, what do you find interesting about the history of this area?
Well, so many things. I think the big thing is that it's, and it's kind of, I think more and more people are becoming aware of it, but it's been underplayed in the past. And that's our huge, often indirect, but substantial influence on American culture in general. One of the things, and I don't think anyone's ever looked into this in depth. I might not be the person to do it, but we think about the Warner Brothers. Okay.
Yeah.
The Warner Brothers. Jack Warner wasn't born here. He was born in Canada, but he came here as a toddler, was raised here, made jokes about the fact that he was in Youngstown. He had a gag name card or business card that had some made-up business from Youngstown, Ohio, that he would pass on to people even later in life. Okay. And when you think about what made the Warner Brothers distinct, it's that they were the first, the studios, to produce films that dealt with ethnic people, that dealt with working class themes.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that.
And in fact, if you look at the first, and this is interesting. I mean, it might not sound edifying, but the gangster films were the first ones that did that. They're the classic gangster films.
Right.
Okay, up until Little Caesar and The Public Enemy and Scarface, the original Scarface
Right.
with Paul Muni. Really, when you dealt with gangsters, they were the swarthy people in the background. There was always a good Anglo-American Protestant who was falling into sin, and some virginal young woman was going to save him, from these horrible ethnics, okay. I mean, that's kind of the way it was, okay.
Yeah.
And in the classic cycle gangster films, those three films I mentioned, you have, and it may not be an entirely positive character, but the protagonist is an ethnic figure who's front and center.
But they're kind of all of the sort of prestige TV we have now. We're like, I think of like Breaking Bad. They're anti-hero films.
They're
sort
anti-hero
of,
films.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, they were. And
It's kinda
that was
something
also
that's popular now.
And I think they were also forerunners in that regard, because they did produce some of the first anti-heroes, because there's a part of you that's cheering for Jimmy Cagney
Right.
or Edward G. Robinson or Paul Muni, whatever it happens to be.
He's
but
on
the
top
other
of the
thing,
world.
That's exactly right. But they're also ethnic people who have a voice.
Right.
And then, of course, you start to see films in which there were more positive characterizations of ethnic groups. But I think they really were the first studio to show working class ethnic people as something besides the scenery, okay?
Sure.
They were in the foreground. And that has a lot to do with the fact that Jack Warner came of age in Youngstown, I'm sure, because he played oftentimes an annoying role, as far as his brothers were concerned, in picking the scripts. Supposedly, he was the one that selected Little Caesar, because it had been written, the novel had been written by a gentleman, I'm not going to remember his full name, Carroll, I believe was the last name, but he was an Ohio author. And his character, Caesar Bandello, was born in Youngstown, and that's mentioned in the book. Okay. And so he said, "We're gonna turn this into a script," and so that's a real connection between Youngstown and popular culture.
Right.
That's not too easy, not too difficult, rather, to track when you think about it. And then, of course, when you think about, I just wrote an article recently on baseball history, and this is where kind of family history intersects with the larger history of the community, which is also interesting, because you get stories, but then when you start examining those stories, you can find out what's true and what isn't. Oftentimes, surprisingly, they're supported by the facts. Okay,
It's true.
and that is
there's no way that happened. You're like, oh, it did.
It did. And
It
the more
did in
unlikely,
Youngstown.
the more likely it happened.
more likely. Yeah.
That's right. And I had one great uncle was a Major League Baseball player. He did not have a super distinguished career because he was a wonderful base runner, outfielder, but not a great batter. And you needed to be a consistent batter.
Right.
And so he was continually being farmed out by the owner of the St. Louis Browns to a team called the Indianapolis Hoosiers, which was part of the Western League, which was the best-run minor league in the country. He set a base running record which has never been beaten, but which was later rejected. I think because they said, even though he replicated on numerous public occasions, I think personally he was a little bit of a hot dog, and there was probably some people in the baseball community or elite that didn't like him. I don't know, but whatever the case, he was deprived of that honor. He did go on to become a minor league baseball manager, and he managed a team here in Youngstown called the Youngstown Ohio Works. And this is where Billy Evans' story becomes relevant, because he was the one who hired Billy Evans, who was a reporter for the Youngstown Vindicator, a sports writer for the Youngstown Vindicator, to umpire a game when the umpire didn't show up. And he was so impressed, he started hiring him on a regular basis. And he may have played a role in him becoming the league umpire for the Ohio-Pennsylvania League. That was the minor league that included Youngstown's team. Another figure, and through my research on this relative, I became aware of a gentleman named Jimmy McAleer. And Jimmy McAleer was a fishing buddy of Ban Johnson. He was had been he was a veteran player and manager. Had played for the Cleveland Spiders, obviously a predecessor of the Guardians today.
Right.
And in any case, he was responsible for organizing 2 of the original teams of the American League. He recruited a lot of those players who otherwise might not have joined the new American League.
Sure.
And what also became evident in that research is one of the reasons that the American League prevailed, because there have been so many outlaw leagues that were essentially suppressed, is because the National League was a mess. Okay, if you went to a game, it was such a raucous affair that women and children stopped attending. Okay,
Sure.
there is a list of things that baseball players. This is a 19th century list, late 19th century list, of phrases and terms that baseball players should not use. And it's the kind of creativity that's just mind-blowing. It would make us blush. Okay?
Right, right.
And so in any case, the big problem, and this is a problem with soccer, European soccer as well, is if you don't agree with the umpire, riot.
Sure.
If you don't agree with the umpire, throw a bottle at him, break his jaw. Okay, so
Yay.
so essentially,
Gotta support the team.
That's right, exactly. So Ban Johnson, when he took over the Western League, which he eventually turned into the American League, he said the umpire is the last word. He elevated the role of the umpire. And it's not inconsequential that by 1906, this is 5 years after the establishment of the American League, on the recommendation of Jimmy McAleer, he hired Billy Evans as the youngest ever umpire in Major League Baseball, and the umpire who was played the biggest role in shaping and the role of the modern Major League umpire. He wrote a number of books on it, and he's in the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Right.
But essentially, that's again an example of where Youngstown played an indirect but powerful role
Right.
in what is now the American pastime, but had been on the road to ruin at that point. Really, it had become a disgrace. When you think about the food industry, obviously, and
Right.
I think I do one talk that's called "Tastemakers of the Valley," and it talks about the fact that 3 of the food empires of the United States came out of the Youngstown area.
Okay.
And one, of course, is Arby's. We all know Arby's.
Arby's. Yeah. I don't know why I didn't think of Arby's.
And
maybe McDonald's, kind of.
Well,
sort
not
of.
so much. Arthur Treacher's there might be a justification for Arthur Treacher's because it was based here for a while, but it didn't start here.
Okay.
Isley's
I thought
didn't.
Ray Kroc was from the area or something. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, that's something to look. I'll look into that. Okay.
Well, isn't there? I can't remember why that McDonald's is there in Niles. The most magnificent McDonald's, the big old.
That's right.
There's some kind of connection locally.
I remember
can't
when that
remember
opened.
what it
Yeah, they
is.
had a grand piano, and
It's still there. Yeah,
it's still there. But it was the most elegant McDonald's in the.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Okay, but I'm sorry, I got us off track. So Arby's.
Arby's, Good Humor, obviously. Good Humor started here in the
yeah.
area, and that, of course, became, it was not only a product, the Good Humor bar, which is still available today through Unilever, but a whole approach to vending that is still with us today, even though
Right.
Good Humor is not in that regard. It's not out in the neighborhoods. The other, of course, is Isley's, which we tend to think of. It didn't start here, but it really took off after it was headquartered here. The family moved here for the most part.
Right.
And even though it was regional, it was really never outside of Ohio, Pennsylvania. In 1950, it was the single largest chain in the world.
Wow.
And of course,
Okay, I
its
didn't know
products, right? And I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I'm surprised all the time with
Right.
research. And the other thing is, of course, its products are still available through Unilever. You can go to Giant Eagle or anywhere else and find Isley's products. So again, a disproportionate impact on American popular culture, I guess you could say. But there's so many examples. I mean, those are a few off the top of my head that I think are significant. There are other things that we could emphasize that we don't, and I know this from my own family history, is that when we think about the connection between this area and places in Europe, one of the ones that's neglected is the English Midlands.
Okay.
Because, of course, obviously, East Liverpool because the West Midlands in England were the center. That's where the center of the ceramic industry was.
Okay.
But you also had a connection to Youngstown, because a lot of Irish immigrants, in particular, who were escaping the famine, settled in a place called Wednesbury, and it's often mispronounced as Wednesbury. We don't say Wednesday. Okay?
Right. I know.
So
that's why it's spelled
Wednesbury,
like that.
yeah, it's spelled like that.
Teach
right.
my daughter how to read and write, and I got to deal with the English language all the
Oh,
time.
it's
ridiculous.
It's not consistent.
No, not at all.
But Wednesbury ended up being a host for scores and scores of Irish immigrants who weren't treated very well. In fact, that's a little bit of family lore that I came across. My great-grandfather was supposedly had to fight his way to the national school every day when he lived in Wednesbury, and a teacher who was compassionate taught him how to box, and then he said, and then one day he said, "Okay, you're all going to fight Pat, but this time one at a time." And apparently he beat everyone in the class, and that is a story that was borne out by my research on Wednesbury, because it was that bad. It was that bad. The Irish town was a place where the bobbies didn't go.
Yeah.
Okay. The conditions.
But this teacher's solution was, well, I'm going to organize a fight. That'll fix it. You know what I mean?
Oh,
it did. It sounds like it worked. It sounds,
These are 19th century Moories.
That's what I'm saying. But it's just, by today's standards, it's like, that just sounds crazy. But
that doesn't sound like something we would do
today. But at the same time, hey, it worked, sounds like,
It apparently did for him. And I guess that he wanted to go on in school, but his father was insisting they move the second leg of their journey, so to speak, to the U.S. And the parish priest to St. Mary's, which is still there, was so concerned about the plight of Irish Catholics living there that he basically organized one cohort after another to go to Argentina, or Brazil, which didn't work very well, and then to go to industrialized cities in the U.S. And so this was an organized venture. Sally Murphy Pallanti, who wrote the first book and evidently the last book on the Irish Americans in Youngstown, also had that connection. Part of her family passed through that area. And that's significant because these people moved on to craft positions in the mill. They had skilled positions, puddlers, rollers, what have you. Michael McGovern, the puddler poet, okay? This is one thing that gave the Irish an edge. The other thing is that they weren't the only group that passed through Wednesbury. Lots of Scottish, Welsh, English, people who ended up in this area and moved into what was then the iron industry.
Well, again, we've got a big Eastern European population.
We've got a big Eastern European population, yeah. And we have places, and I think that was another connection that I think was made recently. There was a big Youngstown presence at a conference in Palermo, I think. Because we have... in fact, one of the things we could do as a community that would be interesting, and I know Toledo does that, they have sister city relationships that are not one-shot deals. These become ongoing relationships. And one of the benefits of that, and I was lucky enough, I was living briefly in Toledo in the 1990s, or mid-1990s, and I actually participated in a sister city program between the city of Toledo and Szeged, Hungary, and spent a summer in Hungary, which was great, okay? But one of the benefits of that was that when Toledo, Spain, said, hey, we're going to allow El Greco's works to travel throughout the United States in the 1980s, guess where they went first? Toledo Museum of Art, exactly. Okay,
Yeah.
So there are benefits to doing it. In the case of something like Wednesbury, not only are there strong connections between this area and that community, but they experienced the same phenomenon of deindustrialization. That could be a city we could identify with and build some relationship with. We haven't. No one even knows about it. No one knows about Jimmy McAleer, for that matter. And Jimmy McAleer not only helped to establish the American League, he was the one who got William Howard Taft to throw out the first ball of the season. So he introduced what became a cherished baseball tradition.
Okay.
So there were so many aspects of local history of which we're absolutely ignorant. And the more we get to know about the various communities that make up Youngstown, or the Youngstown area, the richer our awareness of that history will be.
717 Credit Union. Business services designed to meet your daily needs. Commercial loans, business deposits, merchant and payroll services. 717 Credit Union. It's knowing you were treated right every time.